Okay, so let's begin our 5 minuter on interaction patterns in the language classroom. Interaction patterns are, the use of interaction patterns in the language classroom is part of classroom management. And in this 5 minuter, I'd like to talk about lockstep and pair work. Um, so lockstep is one type of interaction pattern. The word lockstep actually comes from the military. We can see some women here, soldiers marching in lockstep. And the term has been imported into teaching, into classroom, the area of classroom management, to describe a certain type of interaction pattern. And it does have its uses. I mean, we can all remember being transfixed by our preschool or elementary school teacher telling us a story in lockstep, and we just sit there listening. And this, of course, is a very effective use of lockstep. Lockstep does have its place in the classroom. It's also a very good way of giving instructions as well, having everybody listening to you as you give the instructions. But really, what we want in our language classroom is something that looks more like this, with the students working in pairs. And this is something that's always emphasized on teacher training courses. I remember the first teacher training course I took in 1993, and on the very first day, they insisted so much on the use of pair work in the language classroom. And I really couldn't understand why. And it was quite difficult for me, actually, to make that transition to putting my students into pairs, because I hadn't been educated in that way. In the 80s, I grew up with teachers standing at the top of the classroom speaking and the students listening passively. And I still see this an awful lot when I observe classes. I see very little pair work and a lot of lockstep. So what's the problem with lockstep? A lot of teachers know they should be putting their students into pairs, and they don't for some reason. So they obviously think that lockstep is something useful and positive, and we've seen that it can be, but there are some major disadvantages to lockstep. The first problem with using lockstep all the time is that it ignores the social dimension to learning. Learning is many things, but one aspect of learning is the social dimension. We tend to learn more effectively if we learn from our peers, we learn from each other rather than in a vacuum. So interacting with others is a very good way of learning things, and pair work allows that interaction. Lockstep doesn't allow students to learn at their own pace. Students have to follow the pace, much like the soldiers marching all in unison that we saw in the first slide. Students have to follow the pace set by the teacher or by the rest of the class. So if there are students that want to go faster, or if there are students that want to go slower, they can't, because they're stuck going at the pace set by the group as a whole, which sometimes isn't a problem, but most of the time, in order to learn something or get our heads around something, we do need a bit of personal space in order to think about it and learn at our own pace. And pair work provides an environment in which we can do this. Lockstep makes the students more reliant on the teacher. Um, um, Everything is directed by the teacher in lockstep, and this can be quite comfortable for the students, actually, because they don't really have to do anything. Um, but of course, the best learners are the learners that learn for themselves or by themselves, autonomously. And this is an idea that I first heard, the idea of learner autonomy, in the 80s, actually. I remember seeing it in a TV documentary in the late 80s, that the teacher needs to be the guide by the side rather than the sage on the stage. And so therefore, this idea has been around since the 1980s. And when I observe classes, I'm still seeing that sage on the stage. And the students are not really learning for themselves. They assume a very comfortable, passive role. And that can't be good. Lockstep also gives students less of a chance to practice their English because the teacher speaks most of the time. The students in Lockstep mostly listen most of the time. 90% of the time, a student in a Lockstep interaction pattern is listening and not actually using the language. They're not practicing the language unless they're called upon by the teacher to do so. So therefore, the more Lockstep you use in your classroom, the less chances to practice that your students will get. And that can't be a good thing, because meaningful practice is a big part of language acquisition. Lockstep increases teacher talk time. The teacher's the center of everything. The teacher does most of the talking, and the students talk less. This can't be good, because the teacher doesn't need to practice their English. It's the students that need to practice their English. We want the students to be talking most of the time in our classroom. So if we insist on using Lockstep most of the time, what we're doing is we are going to automatically increase the teacher talk time and reduce the student talk time. And that can't be a good thing. Lockstep is really boring for students, and this can be a big problem, and it'll lead to discipline problems as well, and definitely affect learning. If students are bored, they are less likely to learn. It's boring because it's passive. The students have to sit still and listen, and especially for younger learners, it's very difficult to sit still, and teenagers, it's very difficult to sit still for long periods of time. For many adults as well. You need to let go as a teacher and let the students be more active and make it more interesting for them. And the danger is, if you use Lockstep too much, it's going to be a really boring lesson. And finally, Lockstep in this day and age, students are used to using their electronic devices. So we should be allowing them to use their electronic devices to help the learning process. And if the students have to sit still and listen to the teacher, and they're not allowed to move, and they're not allowed to get out their phones and tablets and computers and actually use those devices in order to learn, then we're going to have problems, because especially for younger learners who are digital natives, it's extremely unnatural to not be allowed to use their electronic devices in the classroom. So Lockstep is not a bad thing. It has its place, but the point I'm trying to make is that pair work is really so important. I mean, what they taught me in 1993 on my very first teacher training course still holds true today, and there's still a lot to be done. I still see very little pair work in the classes that I observe. So, food for thought. I hope it's useful.